Hi everyone, my name is Subhashish and I'm speaking to you from India. Imagine if your government imposes an ID that you have to use in all places, public and private, and you can authenticate using three ways to prove who you are, your identity. And those three ways are your iris scan or your fingerprints, or the third option is OTP, a text message containing an one-time password would be sent to your phone, and put a condition on the top of that. You might be disabled or old, your iris or fingerprints can be scanned. You might not own a phone to yourself, or a phone is shared between family members. You are illiterate, or the information on why the system is being imposed is not available in your language. For many marginalized communities in India, this is a reality every day. So many of us keep asking why the design of something that is supposed to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goal 16.9 in creating legal identities for all by 2030 has such an excluding and ableist design. The 2011 Indian census says that 26.8 million people have some or the other form of disability in India. Caribou Digital, a research organization that conducted field research in India, including other developing countries, identified the barrier of information as one of the top 5 barriers that women face in accessing IDs. Lack of information leads to more financial exclusions. When technologies like biometrics are preferred that are even more obscure, both from a technology and social standpoint, biometrics enabled IDs lead to more exclusion of women and other marginalized groups. I interviewed Dr. Savita Bailur, who is a research director at Caribou Digital, to learn more about how biometrics-based IDs affect women in different places.
So when we were doing field work, the government of Cote d'Ivoire decided that all SIM cards had to be registered with a biometric ID. If for some reason somebody did not have a biometric ID, which was pretty much a passport really, so if you didn't have a passport, you would lose access to your SIM card, but more importantly, you would lose access to your mobile money account and any kind of money stored in it. So this kind of unintended consequence, or maybe it was foreseen, but not the impact on the ordinary citizen maybe wasn't kind of understood enough. I think it really shows what a massive impact something so small can have on someone's life. I mean, that's the irony of identification, right? It's like air. If you've got it, you don't think about it. If you don't have it, it becomes critical.
Research after research, backed by statistical and other empirical evidence, concur how public IDs that use biometrics are faulty and are diminishing and dehumanizing to people who are already marginalized, and how they lead to more exclusions rather than helping any form of inclusion. So why did Aadhaar not only begin with biometrics in its core that is proved to be consentless for a person who is disabled, old, illiterate, or is marginalized in other ways? Dr. Usha Ramanathan, who is a prominent human rights advocate and independent researcher, once told me that the authorities behind India's national biometric and virtual ID Aadhaar have always attempted to sell the ID to people, but they have never tried to educate people about it, as that's what salespeople do. The idea behind Aadhaar's rollout back in 2009 was to sell it. As of today, 1.29 billion approximately out of the total population of roughly about 1.39 billion people have enrolled for Aadhaar. We're talking about a centralized database containing the private data of 1.29 billion residents of the world's largest democracy. When I say private data, I mean iris scan, fingerprints, facial images, apart from the usual suspects. Our passports that allow us to travel abroad do not probably have all the data points that Aadhaar collects, and yet Aadhaar is not a proof of nationality. It has been sold to the people saying that it's an all-in-one ID to better the delivery of public services such as ration, subsidised food grains, and other essentials to people below the poverty line. From a privacy standpoint, biometrics are considered to be the sanctorium of all private data, probably after DNA profiling. So IDs such as passports generally collect biometrics so that border control officers can detect any potential terrorist activity. It's absurd to think that someone who is disabled or poor has to be tracked down for any high-risk activities that they might be involved in while collecting rice or kerosene from their village ration store.
This is not about a national ID, remember that. This is about every person belonging on a database. And that's why, whether it's the World Bank or the UN system that's working now, unfortunately, I don't know how much they understand of what they are doing. They are looking at spreading this across the world so that all 7 billion will be on a database that they can access. This is not about providing, and how are you going to stop terrorism with this? You put everyone on there saying that each person, it's a very strange project that where they've said people are corrupt, people become terrorists, people commit crime in various forms, shapes and sizes. People need the delivery of services. And therefore, we need everyone on a database so that we can keep tracking them. And people have to keep coming back again and again to report to us to establish that they are not corrupt, they are not terrorists, they are not committing crime, and to convince us that we should be providing them with services to which they are entitled. So I think, even what you've asked me is part of how this project has been marketed. And if there is one thing that we've learned about both marketing and advertising, the idea is to sell a product, not to explain what the product is.
The obscurity of Aadhaar and the aggressive use of it for government, quasi-government and private services around India has intrigued many, including myself. There has been several statistical and evidential research done in the field of exclusion of different marginalized communities, particularly the beneficiaries of the public distribution system, or the PDS, and PDS is used for the dissemination of ration. The prior and ongoing research helped me a lot to find the functional grips that Aadhaar was creating, and I started to work on a documentary film called MarginalizedAadhaar in 2019 as a part of my digital identity fellowship at UOT. There are three larger thematic areas that I studied to understand more about the exclusion and marginalized communities. The first is access to critical information. The second is digital and other human rights. And third, openness and transparency. I met many marginalized communities around the country and learned from them their experience in using Aadhaar and how they have been told about Aadhaar, by who, and their enrollment process, how they use Aadhaar for the identification and authentication, the challenges and benefits that they have been facing after receiving their Aadhaar, and so on. So one of the early themes that emerged is almost all of them, the marginalized community members that I met, did not have a clear idea why they enrolled for Aadhaar in the first place. In the film, you'd watch a farmer, Dinabandhu Gamango, who's from the Indian state of Odisha. He assumedly told me that he has been receiving loans and it has been easier for him now because everything is digital. Incidentally, he uses a feature phone and he could mostly make calls or receive calls with that. He speaks a language called Sora, which is predominantly an oral language, and even though there is a writing system that was invented in the 1930s, there is a religious bias, there is a religious divide, and many don't use it.
Aadhaar card nama Riana nadi di te subida ni ka ada kolo. Aadhaar card nyanangan delhi. Nami mobile yang janang au anam garan deti. Do Aadhaar card sanle au sarkar sawi janang au tik telai tik nyang tabu. Au Aadhaar card sanle bank ko janang au account khole lebendi tete anengi am galan titilang tanji. Au do au asun rangan ate tata dikte apa ngaji ताते boy health card gamla dekho ताते droga na su medical department pa ताते sanai sai anak itu benji ana anyang lagi anak tu lagi ja do Aadhaar card sanle saunap se mele sarkar saunap mele do account kholi bapai mobile na sanla sanai sai.
Every single indigenous person that I spoke to shared a common element: compliance to government. While Dr. Usha Ramanathan calls the Aadhaar drive sales, I would actually call it forced enrollment. It is a fetish to private data being collected and stored in a centralized manner without informing or educating citizens about how much their rights are at stake. The constitutional validity of Aadhaar has been challenged in courts, and including one, the Supreme Court. And this particular verdict was a landmark judgment that declared privacy as a fundamental right, and it being intrinsic to right to life. Aadhaar was at the core of this particular judgment, and many thought that the massive data collection would stop after that. Or even if the program would continue, it would have only voluntary use, that people would voluntarily enroll and they would voluntarily use it. Users won't be coerced to use for every single service. Today, it is nearly impossible to get things done without Aadhaar, or at least that is how things are structured, and people are told by different public and private service entities. So filing taxes would require Aadhaar authentication. Banks use Aadhaar for almost everything as a de facto authentication medium. And the current vaccination program even suggests that the COVID vaccination could be provided by different authentication processes, and Aadhaar is on the top of the list. There is also discussion for building a national health ID using Aadhaar infrastructure to ramp up vaccination. At the time, where 400,000 daily COVID positive cases are heard about, and then there's a huge shortage of oxygen and medical care. People who are adept with technology can certainly manage with Aadhaar. People who suffer the most because of Aadhaar are the people who are marginalized. Manual labor or old age contributes to the fingerprints not being detected. So that excludes a large portion of people receiving pensions or people with disability from getting their rightful access to food that they must receive for their survival. I got to know about the work of Samit Panda, who is with the Right to Food campaign in my home state, Odisha. The campaign has reported a few instances of disabled persons being denied ration and COVID relief. I spoke to two of them. The first one is a woman who lost her fingers, and when she went to enroll for Aadhaar, the authorities told her that she can't enroll because she didn't have the fingers to provide the fingerprints. And she used to get ration before Aadhaar, and after Aadhaar, she has been denied for 11 months. When there was the relief for COVID, and people were provided with food and some money to survive in the first phase of the lockdown, she didn't receive anything.
আমার পরিবার কইতারে কেউ কাটছিল না হবে তাও তো পরিবার সাথে না হবে আর আগে কাটি দিলে নিয়ে দিলে চাউ এ 11 মাস হলো তো আধার কার্ড নিয়ে যে পরে মোটা হচ্ছে নাকি তো আধার কার্ড না তো চাউ দঙ্গল না কিছু কাজ নাই না যেমন মোর করে সার্টিফিকেট পাইছালে না সরকার যে সেটা বিলে চলবার তো তারপর আগে দুনিয়ারে পরিবারে সব জড়ে গেছে সেটা চাই পরে আসলে স্কুল থেকে আইতে পারবে তারপর ওকে কেন সরকার থেকে দেখে দেওয়া হবে রাতে মাঝি পহলা করে যে মানে নেই হচ্ছে সরকার দেখলে নিতে দেওয়ার তো ফটো ইটি নিয়ে উঠে বেলা.
It almost feels like a dystopian state where there is no human attribute left anymore. To give a context to the anthropological diversity of India that Aadhaar failed to serve, I'd like to share more about the languages of India. There are more than 750 languages spoken across the country, as the People's Linguistic Survey of India surveyed and identified in 2012. I myself speak a few of them with very level of fluency and brokenness. So how do the 104 million Adivasis, the indigenous people, learn how their private information is collected, stored, and used? The clear answer is that they don't. 20 to 30% of India's population is also illiterate. If we assume good faith, there are certainly many Adivasis who are multilingual and are fluent in official languages. And similarly, those who are illiterate might take help from other literate family members or neighbors. But does that justify the fetish to aggressively collect personal data without a data protection law? Does that even infer that the information about the digital rights that Aadhaar seems to touch base are explained well in the official languages? My native language, Odia, which is one of the 22 recognized languages for being used for official purposes. Well, it sounds very promising to have so many languages given the official status as opposed to the only one or two official languages in other countries. I still could not find enough official resource in my own language to educate myself about privacy and security aspects of Aadhaar. So this is clearly not the matter of translating crucial information into different languages, but not having the information in the first place. And I strongly believe that it is by design and not just an unknown gap. Remember what Usha Ramanathan told about selling something? There are actually many ways possible to avail many public services without Aadhaar. However, not a single thing is documented or is kept for people to access easily. It is nothing but a dark pattern. There is so much shared about how to use Aadhaar and what kind of additional benefits Aadhaar would provide. But there is no mention of why one should use Aadhaar in the first place. Remember about the pre-GDPR cookies in your browsers. In fact, the GDPR being only limited to the European Union, many of us who are outside the EU still get the creepy cookies. Aadhaar's design leads to exclusions in biblical proportions because there is effort for literacy of digital and human rights, or even basic literacy. The commodification of personal data of almost 1.3 billion people includes many who are poor, and they have been accused of funneling or being complicit to funneling ration. In fact, Aadhaar has been touted to solve the issue, but economist Ritika Khera finds Aadhaar doing the exact opposite.
The welfare programs were in any case a bit stingy in India. India's spending on social security is amongst the lowest in the world. And so that was one cause of exclusion, is that the net didn't go wide enough. After Aadhaar was included in these programs, sort of added on as a layer in these programs, what happened is that surreptitiously Aadhaar was made compulsory for the programs. So it brought in three different ways in which people began to be excluded. One is those who were unable to enroll, even though that part of the Aadhaar story is perhaps the only successful part of the Aadhaar story, is the phenomenal numbers that they were able to onboard in such a short period of time. Actually, it still has left out a lot of people. And then, of course, there's a little bit of fraud in the enrollment as well that has come to light. But to the extent that it has left out people, these people tend to be the most vulnerable.
Ritika and many other field researchers add largely people that are below poverty line, rural women and people with old age, disabled people, and people who are illiterate or are digital illiterates. So that includes many Adivasis, the indigenous people, and but also many trans persons who are severely marginalized socially and economically. Many transgender persons continue to oppose the very law from 2019 that promised their protection, because perceived gender identity and reservations for the job sectors continue to remain a challenge. As trans persons are historically being marginalized and have been excluded in the Indian society, most find themselves with no jobs and they lose support from their families. Begging and sex work are common for many transgender persons who come from relatively poorer families. Raina Roy, who is a trans sex worker and activist who founded Samabhavana, and Samabhavana is this NGO that, among other important activities, has been working on establishing legal discourse and collective action for the sex workers and for the trans people. And when I spoke to Raina to understand the kind of challenges that trans people face, she shared how she's genuinely worried for her fellow trans workers, sex workers, and other workers. And during the conversation, she also shared how the law enforcement agencies would take coercive action against the sex workers because there is no union and the work is not yet recognized officially.
So the thing is, when the Aadhaar came to mandatory becoming all over the India, do this card, that first of all is, that government trying to keep all the information of all the people of India. They have, about the Assam case, at the time of NRC, that so many Hijra community people been arrested and been genocide, that they were trying to, but one lawyer over there, the trans lawyer, Sati Bidan Borua, made a case for the community, and I think state knows that this unorganized labor sector is very big. If they will rise up, then the entire state system will be fall down.
So anonymity becomes a very important aspect to trans sex workers, and it is key to their life, to their right to life. In the current environment, until there is enough legal protection to them and recognition of their work along with social sensitization, Aadhaar divulges the very anonymity of an individual could have. As a private citizen, it not only has enabled a mass surveillance of constant monitoring through authentication, but has normalized every single private and public agency to ask for Aadhaar, no matter how small the service is. The Aadhaar number, which is supposed to be, in the current design, a securely guarded number, is floating as photocopies and on social media. Raina also told me that many trans women she knows who do sex work assume that they have to provide Aadhaar even for social media and for all communications. That genuine fear and lack of education on digital rights drive away whatever meager they can still earn. Aadhaar as a system is directly tied to the privacy of a person, and that is happening right now. The collection of massive amount of data is happening without the consent of many people, and that is happening without a data protection law in place. There is also a report of mass surveillance, use of facial recognition, and the mammoth growth of Aadhaar puts the life of many marginalized communities in jeopardy. And it's happening without even making them understand, providing them with the information to understand in their own language about their own rights. And this treatment is truly inhuman. It's a war that a small portion of the civil society is fighting with the state. And it's a war that's not going to be won very soon. But the human resilience is limitless. I hope you get to watch the film MarginalizedAadhaar, which is being screened here at Republica. Thank you.